Anurag Bhargava. Welcome to Forbidden Fruit.
Thanks for having me, Griffin.
There's an old joke that goes, capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, and communism is the exact opposite of that. To what extent do you agree?
I mean, is it by joke, do you mean that communism is also the exploitation of man by man? Okay, yeah. I think that it's true. Capitalism is inherently exploitative. And communism is an attempt to create a society which does not have that exploitative nature.
And do you think such an attempt can succeed?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, why don't you explain why?
All right. Well, so in capitalism, like one of the fundamental ideas behind communism is in capitalism, what profit is to a company is the surplus labor of a worker, by which I mean a worker does some amount of work. That work brings in revenue to the company. Now, the company's profit is that revenue minus their expenses, which is what they pay the worker.
Sure, so there has to be a difference between...
Right. So in capitalism, by necessity, a worker must be paid less than the value they provide to the company. Because that's how the company turns a profit, right?
Right.
So that is the exploitative nature of capitalism, in which a worker is not being fairly compensated for their work.
Okay. And how does communism alleviate that exploitative nature?
So the idea behind communism is to remove this profit motive, right? To give the worker the full fruits of their labor. And there are numerous mechanisms for this. One which has been very common, even in our society, is trade unions, right? Like during the 1920s, 30s, trade unionism became a powerful movement, and it was quite connected to communism because it was basing itself on communist ideas. And crackdowns on unionism were also under the guise of anti-communist, like fighting communist rhetoric and communist action.
Sure.
And even today, we still have unions, although in the U.S. they've been severely limited in their power.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So before we get into the real meat here, can you just explain for our audience like the fundamental tenets of communism and capitalism?
Right. So capitalism as an ideology is essentially like the goal of capitalism is to create capital, right? And then that capital can be reinvested to create more capital. It's essentially like the production of wealth is the primary tenet of capitalism, and that's what capitalism values, right? The people who are successful are the people who are most effective at producing wealth.
Yeah.
Now, under communism, it's the production of wealth is not like a valued concept or valued idea. Instead, the value is placed on like providing the basic necessities for people and allowing them to reclaim the value of their labor.
Yeah. So obviously, you know, communism essentially, well, not quite founded, but I guess firstly, most clearly articulated by Karl Marx, right, has inspired a number of regimes, most notably in the 20th century, you know, from the USSR to China. So I have a kind of a difficult question. Can you name me any communist country, you know, on any continent, any decade, and not just communist as in, you know, the Communist Party is their ruling party, but communist as in they have actually not necessarily lived up, but at least are significantly striving towards Marx's idea here. Can you name me any country like that that has had both political, economic stability and longevity?
So you're saying, can I name a country that has fully implemented communism successfully?
It could be a socialist country as well, a country that's striving towards communism, but one that has, I mean, it's tricky depending on how you define success, but like political stability, economic stability, right, you know, basic human rights, and it potentially, you know, has lasted through a number of things.
Well, there are many democratic socialist countries. If we're thinking of like Nordic countries, that's very common. If we're thinking of like fully communist countries, especially during the 20th century, like you said, not many of them were particularly stable or long-lasting for a myriad of reasons. I think there's two main ones. One of them being that, obviously, the U.S. was engaged in many covert actions to sabotage communist parties and communist nations around the world. I think two examples of like communist countries that could have become communist effectively, but were stopped by the CIA before the leader was in power for very long at all, are Nicaragua and Chile, both of which had democratically elected communist leaders. And then both were deposed in Nicaragua, deposed by the Contras, which were funded by the CIA. And in Chile, Salvador Allende was just straight up killed by the CIA. And then if we're thinking of other places where communism's popped up, right, we're thinking of the USSR. It happened after the Russian Revolution. So it's a time of incredible instability. And it, like, regardless of the ideology that was put in place, an aside into authoritarianism was almost inevitable because of the like incredible instability that existed in Russia after the Russian Revolution.
Yeah. So I definitely get what you're saying about kind of U.S. intervention, and I do agree with you that you can't simultaneously be saying, well, you know, socialism is doomed to fail, but also going after socialist countries. I don't think that makes sense, and you know, obviously, I think those actions are pretty undemocratic, and we obviously shouldn't be doing that kind of thing at all. However, right, you know, these specific examples are often cited, but when you look at the whole pattern of communist regimes across the 20th century, right, we've tried it in like South Asia, East Asia, North Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, South America, tried it in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, 60s, etc. And yet, almost all of them have either not lasted or succumbed to like totally authoritarian governments, and you know, millions of deaths have often been involved, like USSR, Cambodia, and China, notably. So you can explain the specific instances, but how do you go about explaining this pattern if communism really is this transformative ideology that is going to kind of guide us to the final stage of history?
That is what Marx said. But I think, obviously, I think that almost all of them were caused by the two reasons that I posited earlier. But I think it's also like good to understand that I don't think communism is like a magic ideology that will fix everything in the world, right? I think it's a set of principles.
So you sort of differ from Marx on that standpoint.
Marx didn't think that either. Marx thought that these are a set of principles which would benefit the world, and we should implement them.
You don't think he was utopian at all? I mean, obviously he didn't.
No, I believe that you can create, like, perfect is subjective, obviously, but I believe that you can create a more perfect society, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not as if just so long as you implement these communist principles and call it communism, like, the society will be perfect, right?
Yeah, sure.
But so, like I said, there's obviously the American intervention and the fact that so many of these regimes came after a big revolution, because that was kind of how communism was spreading at the time, where people were getting fed up with the existing power structures and overthrowing them violently, leaving large power vacuums. I think also it's instructive to note that, yes, communism has caused a lot of harm. I think it's because of improper implementation. But that's not to say that capitalism hasn't caused any harm either, right? Like,
for sure.
We often attribute the harms under communist countries to communism, while attributing the harms under capitalist countries to ideas other than capitalism, right? Like, if we're thinking of the Great Depression, if we're thinking of, like, poverty and starvation, right? These are all, I believe, functions of failures of capitalism.
Yeah. I definitely see what you're saying there. But even if you look at, like, you know, Russia, for instance, the Holodomor.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But the large Ukrainian famine killed like 6 million or something, and this was before.
Holodomor.
Yeah, Holodomor. When you see that kind of thing, and then you see like under Mao, you know, great leap forward, estimates ranging from like 40 to 75 million, or like Pol Pot, and you know, these definitely. When you look at the actual actions of the dictators, yeah, they don't seem to embody communist values at all, right? But the fact is that a lot of these regimes that tried to be communist, you know, in so many different places, so many different personalities, all kind of converge on the same, like, arguably pretty disastrous outcome. So do you think, and you say it's not implemented correctly, you know, I agree with you to an extent, but why do you think that it seems that, true communism is so difficult to implement?
Well, I mean, first of all, communism is only, like, the idea has only existed for about 100 years, right? So, like, and the places, like I said, the places it has been implemented have been places of incredible instability. And I think the deaths that have happened under these regimes are, again, a function of the regimes being authoritarian.
Yeah,
not
but
communist.
why are they authoritarian, though?
Right, because they were coming right off the heels of, like, insurrections. The go-to example I have is in 2016 and up till now, why hasn't Trump become an authoritarian leader, right? He has huge popular support. He clearly has the desire to be an authoritarian, right?
Well, it's because we live in compared to other countries, like ours is very stable legislatively and economically,
right? It's institutions. We have stable institutions.
Which, I might attribute some of that to capitalism, but...
I mean, we can talk about that, but we have stable institutions which which make it more difficult for a person to ascend to, like, an authoritarian power,
or
right?
even impossible, arguably.
I mean, we'll see, we got a couple more years left.
Right.
But meanwhile, these countries had no such institutions, and that's why they ended up descending into, like, this, like, fascist.
Okay, so then if all the countries, right, that are trying communism are, already pretty screwed up in the first place in terms of the institutions, or they're coming out of feudalism or whatever, do you not also see a pretty strong correlation there? Like, why is communism kind of only tried in these countries where it's already coming out of a pretty bad, like, feudalist state? To take the USSR for an example, where in France, in the U.S., in a lot of the Nordic countries, which I think it's debatable, but I think they're arguably capitalist. We don't see, like, anywhere in history these revolutions emerging, and I think you could attribute that to the fact that, well, these societies are in fact kind of already stable. They don't need revolution, right? So,
well, okay. I mean, I just want to, like, caution against, like, again, not every communist regime was, like, authoritarian and brutal, right?
Well, I mean,
some of them were democratic.
Could you name one? Just humor me. Could you?
Yeah, Vietnam, Nicaragua, Chile, like, these were regimes. Like, again, I just want to make clear that the CIA also had a major involvement in, like, the death of communism around the world. But I'll address your point, which is, like, basically these sort of revolutions. Communism has only been implemented in places where it has been like an unstable revolution previously, right? And I think there's a few reasons for this. First, I'm glad you brought up France, because France is an interesting case, right? Obviously,
I know there have been the communist parties in France, right?
Right, but the French Revolution happened, like, much before these ideas had sort of been put down. The Communist Manifesto was, like, 150 years later, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting because if you look into French history, right after the I'm gonna not know names, which I'm sorry about. I should know these names, but I'm not gonna. Right after the French Revolution, right, there was a lot of thinkers who were like, okay, how do we preserve the power structures, or the general sort of, like, the general power structures that existed after the monarchy is dissolved? And one of the foremost thinkers, like, ended up writing a lot about how capitalism could be used as a vehicle to preserve those structures, because the aristocracy already had money. So in a capitalist system, they're already in power, right?
Yeah.
And they could use capitalism as a substitute for the monarchy that existed before.
What do you mean by a substitute?
Like,
or what did they mean, I guess?
They meant as a way to preserve their, like, status in the society. Because they would be the rich people, right? So they would have a higher status than the people who had just implemented the revolution. And I think that's, like, that's a case for a lot of revolutions where it's like, for communism to be implemented in terms of a revolution, right, it needs to be a complete overthrowing of all aristocratic classes and previous institutions. Which is why, because otherwise they will implement some other system to preserve their power.
Yeah.
Which is why I also don't think that revolution is a particularly effective way to implement, like, a communist idea.
So then you disagree with Marx on that as well, right?
Yeah, Marx
as well
was...
as Lenin.
I mean, yeah, Marx was in favor of a violent... He didn't necessarily say violent. He said...
Well, I mean, it's
if
pretty
you
implied,
read
right?
if you read the manifesto, he's essentially, the proletariat needs to take power, right? he doesn't. He does mention like it could be democratically or it could be violently.
I mean, I don't think he mentions this phrase specifically, but is dictatorship of the proletariat not kind of a
Right, but that's
pretty significant concept?
I mean, yeah, but that's my understanding of the phrase is it's essentially like saying instead of a dictatorship of the aristocracy, we need a dictatorship of the proletariat, where he means, the proletariat is consistently referred to in his writings as the majority, right? He's saying most revolutionary movements for like progressive change have been implemented by the minority, right, to grant a previous minority more rights. Well, this is the first revolutionary movement where we are taking a majority group and attempting to grant them rights in a society, right? So when he says dictatorship of the proletariat, I read it as more of just like a democratic slogan, like the people should rule, right? I'm not saying the people should be kings. I'm saying the people should be the ones making decisions.
Yeah, so you said you don't think revolution is particularly effective.
I don't.
So if not revolution, then what exactly? Because, to achieve a communist society, essentially, I think you'd agree with me, like you said, you have to dismantle all these existing power structures. You have to dismantle all of these, I guess, like, private institutions. You have to take down the entire system. So how do you do that without having some kind of revolution or even involving violence?
It's difficult. And I think, like, there's always going to be a place for violence, right? Like, if I think, like, here's an example. The protests, the ICE protests in LA, right? There was violence in those protests. And I saw a clip of somebody talking, and she was saying, like, a month ago, we came out here, we protested, nobody cared. Now we're setting cars on fire, and people are listening to us. And I think violence does have a place in communicating your message. But I think overwhelmingly, the way that these ideas need to be implemented is democratically, right? Again, if we think about the democratic socialist countries in Europe, if we think about, like, there's a New York City mayoral race going on right now that I've been following very closely, because one of the candidates is this Muslim democratic socialist, Zoran Mamdani. I'm a huge fan of him, if you couldn't tell. I really hope he wins. If Andrew Cuomo wins, I'm gonna be so depressed, man. But like, it's a sign that these ideas are becoming more widely accepted as people get educated about them. Like, 20 years ago, socialism was like, it would be a killer. Like, if you outright admitted that, hey, I am a socialist, right? It would be a killer to your political career. But now, people are moving out of the Red Scare propaganda of like the 50s, 60s, even earlier, and starting to like actually look at these ideologies on their own merits and say, I kind of agree with that. Or
sure. I mean, I think, could you not attribute part of that to the fact that we are moving further and further away from these atrocities that have been like omnipresent in a lot of communist regimes and the associations we have with those? I mean, it's some of the most like grotesque things that have pretty much ever happened, like at the same level as the Holocaust, arguably in some cases. I mean, do you think part of it could be that we're moving away from those in history, and it seems more distant? I mean, if you lived through that, right, I think you probably wouldn't be a communist.
That's a fair point. I think it is a part of it, but like if we're thinking about it, right, those instances were also like amplified and taught more by our systems, because it's like, hey, here are the failures of communism, right? So it's like it's a combination of both, in that we are moving away from those instances, and we're also moving away from the propaganda of those instances. I will say, like, obviously China, still a communist country that is committing like atrocities, right? So it's not as if we're not seeing the atrocities committed by ostensibly communist governments, but it is like people are not just seeing the propaganda about it, they're also like taking a look at the ideology for themselves without any sort of like I forget the word. Presuppositions about it, something like that. Yeah.
Right. Well, do you think then that now that we have a broader awareness of these things, and a lot of the intellectuals, ironically, I guess a lot of the bourgeoisie, as Marx would put it, now that we're moving towards more of these ideas, even in small amounts, do you think the U.S. would be better under a actual communist party?
I mean, first of all, you compared intellectual and bourgeoisie. That's not really what Marx meant. When Marx says bourgeoisie, he's saying...
Sure, like, but a lot of the intellectuals are bourgeoisie, right? If you're like an academic would Marx not call?
You are. So Marx's definition of bourgeoisie was people who are the exploiters, the property owners, right? When I was talking about how a worker's value is exploited, right?
Yeah, those who own the means of production.
Those who own the means of production, exactly, yeah. So not necessarily just people who are rich. Like, it's people who own the labor value of others, I think is the actual words, or a paraphrasing of the words he said. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question? I totally forgot.
Yeah, this is that's sort of rambling, but
Yeah.
like, do you think that America, if we actually had the awareness of this, was heightened enough to the fact that we could democratically elect some kind of communist leaders, do you think the situation would be improved under communism?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think for this, it's instructive to look at the last election, right? Where for a little while after the last election, I was really like confused as to why Kamala Harris lost, because it seemed to me like she had performed very well in the debate. The polls were even. She had like quite a lot of money going into it, and so I had trouble understanding why it was such a wide gap. And I think a lot of other people did too. Like, there were a lot of articles afterwards and opinion pieces about like, why did she lose? And a lot of ideas were proposed, right? I wrote an article in the Register Forum about this actually, like, oh, America wasn't ready for a black woman to be president. Oh, America didn't like how she focused on so many woke ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I came to realize was that it's because she wasn't addressing the problems people had, right? Like, people were struggling. People, regardless of what the statistics said, and I hate saying that because I think statistics matter, but regardless of what they said, people were feeling like their lives were worse in a tangible way, right? And so Trump, and to a larger extent, like conservatism in general, comes in and says, hey, you have problems. We see those problems. It's caused by the migrants, the immigrants, the
populism, effectively.
Right. And it's like redirecting that anger onto the already trampled upon classes. South Korea, which I will bring up a lot in this discussion because I believe it is essentially like the
late-stage capitalism.
Yeah, you got it. South Korea has this in that it tells young men that, hey, the source of your problems are the women in your life. They're demanding too much. They want too much, and it's like it's a whole thing there. But I think Kamala Harris's campaign was just saying, hey, the status quo is fine, guys. You should keep voting for us. And I think that if somebody like Bernie Sanders, for example, his whole career has been pointing out, hey, look, these rich people, they're screwing you over. Your landlord is screwing you over. And that's why your life is hard. So elect me and I can help you out and like make your life easier. And he's, I think, for the last 40 years has been the most popular senator in the US. He's like hovering around 60 to 70% approval consistently.
Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Is
It's
that
actually
so?
crazy.
Wow.
A couple months ago, I was like looking into it. I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. Because he says to people, I see your problems. Here's the issue. Here's how we fix them. And so I think the U.S. would be better under like a leader who says those kinds of things and actually works.
But do you think the U.S. would be better if we actually, not just democratic socialism, but socialism, right? We tried to collectivize a lot of institutions,
Industries.
nationalize everything. We try. I mean, I guess I'm not sure about how plausible this is, but to some extent, we eliminate a lot of private property. The free market disappears. And I know the wages wouldn't necessarily be the same, but at least there's some kind of equalization in that sense, right? So do you think we would be better if we could implement all of those Marxist ideas?
I do. I think like when we're thinking about socializing industry, right? Like how many industries are worse because they're privatized? We privatize prisons. And like that's led to there being a monetary benefit for more people going to jail, right? Here in Cambridge, we have privatized ambulances. Like when you see those people on social media saying like, "Oh my God, my ambulance bill was tens of thousands of dollars," it's because we're privatizing them. It's actually interesting. More tangents, I know. I'm sorry. I was doing participatory budgeting this year. Like I was on one of the committees, and one of the suggestions I was considering is like, should we start a program to like just buy an ambulance and have a public ambulance and like have a pilot program for that? If we're thinking about like privatized healthcare, right? We're talking about healthcare bills. I mean, they're ridiculous in the U.S. Insurance is absurd.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And I know one of the things is like, oh, but in Britain they have public healthcare and it sucks. But that is after 30 years of cutting of the NHS. It's one of the big reasons why the Tories, their Conservative Party, lost so badly in this year's election, because they'd been in power for so long and spent so long just gutting the NHS.
Yeah.
And that's why it's like dysfunctional.
Right, right. So you mentioned a lot of these kind of privatized institutions where they shouldn't be, and I think I also agree with you on that for a large part. I don't think we should be privatizing things like prisons or ambulances at all, where really their profit just shouldn't be a part of those institutions.
Yeah.
However, a lot of these other companies that are like driving innovation in the U.S., arguably to some extent, a lot of the stock market and in general the whole laissez-faire thing, you think that should be slashed entirely?
I mean, if you're us, I 100% don't agree with like laissez-faire regulations. I think
Yeah, or even a free market, right?
Right, and I have like pretty strong objections to that, because I mean, even if we're thinking about innovation, right? Like, I'm so close to just ranting about SpaceX, but I'm gonna hold off. NASA could do the same thing. It's fine. It's fine. But I think innovation in capitalism is interesting, because obviously capitalism has led to a lot of innovation.
Yeah.
But when, like, in capitalism, okay, here's an example. Venture capital firms, right? These are a recent thing where they invest a lot of money into small startups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And 99.9% of those startups will fail, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes they hit an Uber. Okay, Uber got pretty big, but Uber's been losing money for so long, right? Like, Uber is just consistently losing money. Why is that? Well, if you've noticed, in the last 5 years, the price for Uber rides has skyrocketed. Like, it's gone way up. And essentially, the idea behind venture capital firms is we'll invest in a bunch of tiny firms. One of them will get big. Then we'll keep giving them money so they can operate at a loss. As they operate at a loss, they can monopolize the market. And once they have a monopoly, they can just jack up prices. They don't have to innovate. They're good, right? And this is the epitome of a capitalist strategy, which is, let's get a monopoly, and then we don't have to do anything because we control the market. And monopolies are directly anti-innovation, right?
Yes,
so I think
for sure.
While capitalism to some extent promotes innovation, to some extent it also limits innovation. And another example of that is, there's this one clip that's really stuck with me, which is a few years ago, Jeff Bezos was like at some conference, and he brought these two workers on, and he's like, hey, these guys actually created like a new sort of, the old stool we use to help people like reach things high up. Yeah. It was bulky, it was inconvenient, so people didn't use it. And then it ended up like, we ended up losing a lot of time in warehouses, because obviously Amazon prioritizes time to like a ridiculous extent, the peeing in bottles and all that.
Right.
And then these two workers, they created a new stool, and this will help us save like hours on every package. Or I forget what the exact thing he said, but it will like help us save a lot of money. And then he said, okay, bye, you can go back to work now, right? Where it's like, the workers created something, and that creation, the money it brought in for the company, was just taken by the company as profit. And so, quiet quitting has become a thing recently, where it's like, I'm just going to do exactly what my contract says for the exact hours, nothing more. And that's essentially people saying, I don't want my excess labor value exploited anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you as little labor value as possible.
Right.
And that's also a way capitalism like limits innovation,
sure.
I think.
But do you think, would it be possible to kind of harness the good of capitalism, all the innovation, and at the same time try to eliminate or alleviate the disparities and maybe the exploitation of labor? Like, is that a possible future, or do we have to go full like Marx? Because I mean, based on your answers so far, I don't think I'm still entirely sure whether you would support the notion of like pushing us into a full communist society.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of what that entails.
I think quite a few times so far you've brought up like a full communist society, right?
Yeah.
And my challenge to you is, does a full capitalist society exist? Like, it's almost impossible for a full society of these to work. Ayn Rand was a big proponent of a full capitalist society. If you read Atlas Shrugged, it's essentially her positing what a full capitalist society would look like. How like the great men of capitalism, which was her big idea, like all innovation is driven by a few great men, would like stop giving to the rest of the world and just create their own society as their own utopia of innovation and free thinking. That's why it's called Atlas Shrugged, right? The people holding up the world
right, yeah.
shrug it off. And I hate that because it's like, it's a cool reference, and I hate her so much, so I'm mad she made a cool reference. But my point is, like, full communism, full capitalism, these things don't exist. But I think that we should move in the direction of socialism, communism, and I think we should move, like, we should socialize industries, like most industries that we have, because I think the core of it is capitalism is an inherently authoritarian structure, right? In any society, you have to choose who you give power to, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the point of society. You collect power in one place so it can do more than it would if each person was only using their own abilities.
Well, I mean, if that's how you conceptualize society, then
I mean,
is it,
that's
then
why
does,
humans.
Does that not mean that communism just rejects society?
That's why humans come together in tribes, right? Because together they're stronger than we're
Right.
stronger together than we are divided, right? So, in any society, you have to make the choice of where are you allocating this power. Capitalism says, let's allocate power to the richest. Power is in the form of money, so let's allocate power. So, power is allocated to the richest, right? While socialism and communism say, no, let's allocate power to the state. And so sometimes that leads to brutal authoritarians.
Well,
but
most of the time, you could argue.
But in a democratic state, it leads to power being distributed among the people evenly.
But how do you get a democratic state if you combine, like, first of all, for instance, in China, all the farming, all the waterworks, like every single industry there is that people rely on. You take all of it, you bundle it up, and you toss it over to like one dude. You just concentrate all of these industries with a few people in the form of the government, and you combine this with like a utopian vision of the future, where as Marx does put it, this is like the final stage of history. It's inevitable. It's almost like you're kind of performing God's will in that way. If history is Marx's God.
Was Marx religious?
But I don't think he's pretty anti-religious.
Yeah,
I think.
like.
But when you combine those two things, I feel like what you get a lot of the time is, a select few that is able to really just adeptly suppress democracy and also enact these atrocities. So a lot of people would say that, like, that's not a bug, but kind of a feature or inherent to communism.
I mean, I just disagree. Like, communism, like I said, is just the idea of collecting power in the government, right? But, like, how do you create a government that is not inherently exploitative, right? Just think about the way the U.S. has done it, right? You have democracy, you have checks and balances, you have institutions, right? And the U.S. isn't perfect, but it's like, it is like a representative democracy,
Yeah.
So I think that, like, I don't think that this sort of, I don't think that collecting power in the government necessarily leads to tyranny.
Yeah, sure, maybe not necessarily, but I mean, like, you can theorize all you want about what communism could be, but we have seen it play out repeatedly, time and time again, like on basically every continent in every decade in this exact same way. I mean, how can we just kind of discount that as like, oh, it's the capitalist countries, or oh, they're coming out of a revolution? I mean, again and again and again, if communism is really, I mean, I know you rejected the term like transformative before, but if it really is more perfect, shouldn't it be able to uplift these struggling countries rather than, confine them to a worse authoritarian government?
I mean, I'm trying to like think. So you're saying, I see, yeah. I think that, like, I still don't think that this pattern of so many failed communist countries points to like an inherent failing within communism, right? And I've told you why. And again, there have been successful democratic socialist countries, right, that have successfully implemented socialist principles and socialized industries. I think Norway, for example, like, has socialized its oil industry. And that's its biggest industry. Norway makes its money through offshore oil mining.
Sure.
And that industry is completely socialized. It is fully owned by the government. But Norway is not any kind of tyranny because it is still a democratic country.
Right, but
Right?
it's also not really socialist, right? I mean, yeah, you have socialized industries, but by and large, you've plenty of private property, you've plenty of private companies, a lot of competition. For instance, IKEA, this like juggernaut of consumerism, comes out of the Nordic countries. I can't remember which one, but I mean, like
Sweden.
Sweden, yeah, but arguably there's still retain like majority capitalist features rather
I mean,
than socialist.
again, like Norway, oil is their biggest industry. If you look at like their GDP,
Yeah.
majority of it comes from oil. So if we're just saying like what percentage of their economy is socialist or capitalist, right? You would say Norway is a majority socialist economy.
Well, I mean, it's not like a percent of your. It's more like a cohesive system, right? But would you still say that the system, by and large, is closer to socialism than it is capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would. And again, like socialism, like communism, socialism have had failures, but it's not a function of communism and socialism. Just like, and we're again glossing over a lot of capitalism's failures. Where,
Sure.
there's this like black book of communism. It's
Yeah.
like a.
I've heard the 100 million.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting because a lot of that, for example, that counts the Nazis that the Russians killed during World War II.
Mm.
So, propaganda, you're not immune to propaganda. But there's also like a black book of capitalism. I haven't read it. I want to read it at some point, but I've heard of it, which is like essentially we have to acknowledge capitalism's failings too. We can't just say like, oh, every communist country has failed, even though some of them failed because of outside influence, and some of them failed because it was an authoritarian country anyway, and some of them did succeed, but like they're not all the way communist. It's like you just keep adding on caveats and then going back and saying, oh, well, but they all failed, so it can't work in the future.
So at what point will we learn that it either works or doesn't work?
So you're basically saying like, what would make you think it doesn't work?
Yeah.
I'm just sorry. I'm just remembering your talk with Marco, and then he asked the same question to you.
Right. No, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. That was a stumper for sure. It's a tricky question.
But I think like I honestly do think that it works, and I think we've seen examples of it working. I think that like I think it works. That's the answer. I think it does work.
Well, right, but let's just say, right? Let's say that you've been completely indoctrinated. Let's just suppose that. I mean, and currently you're blissfully unaware of this.
Sure.
So, I mean, how many more kind of failed countries would it take for you to say, all right, maybe we should have more of this hybrid, like we have in the Nordic countries and socialism?
Okay, I see your question. I think for me, it would have to be showing how the failings are directly caused by communism and not by another influence.
How do you do that, though? I mean, it's hard to. Isn't that kind of a counterfactual? Or is that?
My understanding of counterfactual is like, what if this thing in history was different? How would history look? How would the present look? But like, but no, I think you can diagnose why a country failed or why a thing happened, right?
But I mean, there's so many factors.
That's the whole
right?
study of history.
Yeah.
Right. Like, but I think, like, I right now, from all that I've researched, from all that I've read, from all that I've seen, I think communism is more effective.
So there's, going back to kind of what Marco said again, but is there literally no amount of like more failed communist or socialist regimes that would convince you that it doesn't work?
It depends on the nature of the failing. Like, what is causing the failing, right?
Sure.
If the CIA killed 20 more communist leaders, I'm not going to be like, oh, now communism doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense.
I see what you're saying. Okay. So in the U.S. right now, do you think we are living in like a? Do you think? I don't know how to phrase this. I mean, obviously the society needs improvement, but do you actually think that like capitalism, as we know it right now in the U.S., in France, in the U.K., is just this kind of parasitic ideology that is like kind of it explains a lot of our failures right now?
I think it is, and I foreshadowed this earlier.
Yeah.
South Korea, right? Like, obviously, we've had this talk a couple times before, and one of the times you had the talk, you said you were in favor of a strictly regulated capitalism, right? And I think that's an interesting idea. I just don't think it's possible to like keep those regulations on consistently.
But I think we kind of have that with the Nordic countries.
But they have socialized industries, right?
Sure.
When so much power is concentrated in the government, that's why they're capable of like regulating them to this extent. And I still think capitalism is a parasitic force, right? The trend of capitalism, right? let's just imagine a scenario. I have 10 dudes, all of them have $500, right? If one dude makes more money, right, they have the capacity to make more investments, to undercut their competitors, right? And they can get more money, right? The more money you have, the more money you can make. It takes money to make money, right? So the trend of capitalism is naturally centralizing power, right? And trying to regulate that is like, it's pushing back against this like constant, endless tide. And I don't think there's a way to make that sustainable. I think that inevitably, without like progressive change, a capitalist country will end up like South Korea, where the government is functionally controlled by, they're called the chaebols. It's like I believe it's a South Korean word meaning like large company.
So they're like a plutocracy, basically.
Like a plutocracy. I think Samsung, Hyundai, and a few others, right? These companies and their leadership control everything. It's actually like, it's crazy. If you look into the pattern of politicians in South Korea, a politician will get elected. There will be some corruption scandal. Either they will be revealed to be corrupt, or somebody in their inner circle will be revealed to be corrupt. They'll be taken out of power, right? And then soon after, the courts will say, okay, we'll commute your sentence for the good you've done. But in that process, every time a politician gets elected, they end up giving more power to these powerful companies.
That's true.
And then the power, it just keeps accumulating. And South Korea is like horrible. I mean, the rate of suicide is incredibly high. There's like, I think it's like 40% or something of people say they want to get out because they don't feel that they can continue living in those conditions.
Right. Now I definitely see what you're saying, and these seem like pretty bad conditions. However, if we're gonna go talking about specific countries, I'm not sure how you can exactly make that argument. If I mean, we've like case study after case study of communist countries, right? But all of these can be chalked up to other factors. And then we have this one capitalist country among a lot which have really maintained stable political and economic institutions. Well, why does that then prove that capitalism is like parasitic and flawed?
So 2 parts of that question. One is like obviously, as I was saying earlier, it's about like how you can trace the cause of this, right?
Yeah.
If you look at South Korea, essentially what happened was, obviously North and South Korea were big pawns in the Cold War, right? North Korea ended up becoming very authoritarian, backed by the USSR. South Korea was backed by the US. And if you look at, I'm trying to remember the year, I think it was 70-something, the leader elected said, hey, he got the favor of the US by saying, look, I will implement capitalism, I'll give power back to the free market to these companies, right? And then every leader afterwards said the same thing. They'll say, I will give more power to these companies. And so I think in South Korea, you can directly trace this as a cause of capitalism. And I think I would also caution against saying that like the US and France are stable, right?
I mean, they're among the most stable countries.
I think one of the like big things about capitalism.
What are we comparing that against?
Well, I think one of the big things about capitalism is, we say late stage capitalism is the cause of all these problems, right? But like the implication there is that for a long time, capitalism does work mostly fine for people, right? It's only once you get to this late stage that it starts causing so much harm. I think the monopoly was originally intended to be like a very scathing criticism of capitalism, which is a little funny. There's a quote, capitalism subsumes all criticism into itself, which is basically saying you can make something that criticizes capitalism, but it'll end up benefiting capital owners. Squid Game is another example of this. Like how commercialized these things have become.
Right.
But if you look at monopoly, right, it's like, it's such a long game. For a long time, you're just playing normally. You're going around the board.
And then eventually,
somebody ends up controlling everything, right?
Right.
Another thing is interesting is, who plays Monopoly that long, right? Nobody gets to the end there. So nobody really gets to see the message. And I think that it's a perfect metaphor for capitalism in that way, where it shows the sort of path of capitalism, but it's also like so long, nobody really realizes that this is like an inherent flaw of capitalism.
So I mean, are we there yet, or are we going to get there soon?
I think in the U.S. we're getting there. I mean, again, I was talking about like private prisons, private ambulances. These things weren't privatized forever. A lot of them, healthcare has been privatized forever. But like if we're thinking about prisons, private prisons are a pretty recent thing. I think there was recently like an expose that some of the ICE agents, they're just hiring like private contractors to do this stuff, right? If you look at like when banks collect debts, they will sell them for pennies on the dollar to these debt collecting agencies,
Yeah.
right? Who will like hire private bounty hunters to collect these debts,
Wow.
right? It's crazy. There's this comedian, John Oliver. He essentially does weekly shows about a topic. Sometimes, usually it's not very prescient, right? It's like something pretty random, but it's the, essentially, he's saying, here is a problem that exists in society that you probably didn't hear about. And almost always what's happened is something got privatized. Here's another one. Death inspections. So you know how you have coroners who will like discern the cause of death, right?
Right.
In a lot of places, those positions have started to become privatized.
Wow.
And what's ended up happening is like they're done terribly. They're like they cover up police crimes a lot of the time. So I think that we're certainly getting there. I don't, and even if we take a more macro view, like Elon Musk was able to buy his way into government, right? I mean, that's crazy. That shouldn't be possible in a democracy. But that's what capitalism does. And I'm hopeful it's reversible still. But, you know, I don't know. Maybe we're past the point of no return.
If it's reversible, would that not suggest that, you know, regulations can create a capitalist society that is stable and, I mean...
Well, I don't think it can be stable, right?
Okay.
Like, I'm saying it's reversible in that if we can, like, but, like, if we just go back to where we were 20 years ago, I don't think that's stable. I don't think that that's, like...
So what are we comparing this to? Like, what's your example of a stable country?
Of a stable country? Oh, you mean, I don't... Yeah, I don't think any country can be truly stable.
Well,
right?
so then,
like,
why are you talking about like these capitalist countries being unstable if like no country has ever been stable?
Like you
right?
were saying, right?
I mean,
so many factors come into play. Now, capitalism versus communism is a debate on how the economy should be run.
Yeah.
I believe communism is a more egalitarian, more stable way of running the economy. That doesn't mean that other things can't make the society unstable. But I believe that communism is a better way of running the economy than capitalism is, right?
Yeah. And do you think that because of, you know, the inevitable failure of all these capitalist institutions, will we see a true workers' revolt? Will we see a communist utopia emerge?
We've seen workers' revolts. I don't know. I like oscillate between this based on how my mental state is. You know, if I'm like feeling happy, I'll be like, you know, maybe we can do it. We can like get popular support, create like a democratically based coalition to move back in the direction of like communism. And then if I'm feeling like not so great, I'll be like, oh man, I mean, Elon Musk literally bought his way into government. Like the top, like 0.1% own as much as the bottom 50%. It's just too much of a gap. And I oscillate between the two, but I can't honestly tell you that I'm sure it'll happen one way or another.
Sure, yeah. And I guess, I don't know how we are on time.
Actually,
but,
yeah, that's
yeah, I think we might have to wrap up soon, but I have one last question for you. If you could ask Karl Marx anything, what would it be?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I don't know much about the guy, like, as a person.
All right, if you could ask your favorite socialist or communist leader anything, what would it be?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I feel like I just asked them to, like, explain their like ideas to me, because you can only get so much from reading what they wrote, right?
Right.
I feel like it'd be more beneficial to just be taught directly. You could like get the ideas in a better form than just like reading and trying to understand them. So just like ask them to teach me about their ideology, I think.
Okay. Well, yeah. I hope our listeners learned something today, and I encourage everyone to do their own research on this topic.
Yeah.
After all, it is the future of our civilization, right?
Of course.
That's the economy. So, yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Griffin.
It was a pleasure.
Pleasure.